We have only 6 more weeks to finish up with Revelation.
Well, I'm enjoying Revelation.
I'm learning a lot more than I ever knew.
Well, that's good. That's what it's all about.
If I could only remember it.
Yeah, that's the
I
problem.
may have to get a.
Well, today we are into chapter 15.
Mr. Teacher, sir,
Yes,
what's the deal on moving?
I'll announce
middle of the
that.
month.
Will I be here when you announce it?
Oh, no, you won't. We don't know for sure. We don't have the paperwork yet, and we're
Okay.
not moving until we get the paperwork. So as soon as we get the paperwork, we'll move.
At this
Okay.
point, we're hoping the middle of the month, but that's just a tentative
Depends
date.
on them.
So I will make sure that you are informed
Thank you, sir.
whenever it is. Chapter 15, we're in a point where there's still some things to come from John. The final horrors have not yet been unleashed upon the world. The final battle between good and evil has not yet taken place. And after all of that, the final blessedness is yet to come. Now, we've been told all about the opening of the 7 seals, if you'll remember back when we went through all of that. And then we went through the bit about the sounding of the 7 trumpets and all the problems that brought upon the world. Now we come to the 7 bowls of wrath. The 7 bowls of the wrath of God, which are about to be poured out upon the world.
I don't know if there's much wrath left.
Well, according to John, the worst is still yet to come.
Oh, that's
I think it
encouraging.
has started.
Wow.
So, beginning with chapter 15, John says, I saw in heaven another great and marvelous sign. 7 angels with the 7 last plagues, which are the bowls of wrath. Last because with them God's wrath is completed. Thank heavens. Once that's over with, it's
We
over.
have 7 bowls to move through, and then we're.
Yes, and we're done with God's wrath. And I saw what looked like a sea of glass mixed with fire, and standing beside the sea, those who had been victorious over the beast and his image, and over the number of his name, they held harps given them by God. So as chapter 15 opens, the scene is in heaven. And we are looking at those who have come through their martyrdom for Christ, and they stand beside a sea that appears as glass. That may sound familiar to you because back in chapter 4, verse 6, there was the whole scene of the sea of glass, or what appeared to be as glass. But this time the glass is intermingled with fire, fire being the symbol of judgment. So if you could picture this scene in your mind, this vast sea of shining glass interspersed with the flames and the fire of judgment being reflected. I mean, this is a pretty apocalyptic scene. But the martyrs have emerged victorious from their contest with the forces of the Antichrist. It is, in fact, the very fact that they've suffered horrible deaths that makes them victorious. If they had not persevered in life, if they had not been faithful to the end through their martyrdom, they would have been defeated, and they wouldn't be martyrs, right?
Right.
Okay. See, the early church always described a day of martyrdom as a day of victory. This is something that's a little bit foreign to our way of thinking. But when a Christian or a group of Christians were taken out and crucified by the Romans, the church considered that a day of victory. The Christians who walked into the Colosseum in Rome to be slaughtered or eaten by beasts or whatever the case, they saw their entry into the Colosseum as walking into the gates of heaven. And for the most part, we're told they were very serene, and very calm, and completely ready to accept what was happening to them.
I'd be screaming to death.
Isn't that kind of like the attitude of some of the Muslims nowadays?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, well, it could be, yeah. You know, the human mind is capable of insulating itself very effectively when it becomes necessary. And sometimes that's a good thing, and sometimes it's not such a good thing. This thing kind of puts us in mind of a quotation of Jesus from Matthew chapter 16, where Jesus says, whoever would save his life will lose it, and whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. And I think that's pretty much the attitude that these people must have had. Then in verses 3 and 4, it says, with the harps given them by God, they sang the song of Moses, servant of God, and the song of the Lamb. And it goes like this: great and marvelous are your deeds, Lord God Almighty. Just and true are your ways, King of the ages. Who will not fear you, O Lord, and bring glory to your name? For you alone are holy, and all nations will come and worship before you, for your righteous acts have been revealed. Okay, you got two songs being sung here in this scene. The Song of the Lamb, that may be familiar to you, because just recently in chapter 14, verse 3, we went through that, and we said that was the song which only they could learn, because they had been the only ones that had been through what they had been through, so they were the only ones who could sing that song. And then there's the Song of Moses, which comes right out of Exodus chapter 15, verses 1 through 10. It is the song which Moses sang to God after the crossing of the Red Sea.
Okay, bye.
So if you want to refresh your memory on that, you can read for yourself chapter 15 in Exodus. The Song of Moses is actually sung at every Sabbath evening service in every synagogue to this day.
I don't remember the song being in the text.
Well, it is.
Okay, but I take your word for it. I think I would have remembered a song.
Well, now, Bruce, remember, for all of us here today, it is difficult for us to remember many things.
Yes, sir.
Anyway, Exodus chapter 15, if you want to take a shot at it later. This is sung at every synagogue, every evening Sabbath. So the martyrs have been safely brought through the sea of persecution, okay, to the promised land of heaven, and they sing the Song of Moses. Okay, that makes sense now. The martyrs have their own song, and it is entirely composed of quotations from the Old Testament as follows, and this isn't any shock to any of us. Great and wonderful are your works. Psalm 92, Psalm 111, Psalm 98, Psalm 139. Who shall not fear and glorify your name, O Lord? Psalm 86. You alone are holy. 1 Samuel 2, Psalm 99, Psalm 111. All the nations will come and worship before you. Psalm 86. Your righteous judgments are made manifest. Psalm 98. All of this song of praise is pulled right out of the Psalms in the Old Testament.
Is this something the rabbi sings, or does the group sing automatically as
I
they
think
go?
it's probably a cant.
I can't,
right?
no, they're called the cantor.
Yes, a cantor in the Jewish synagogue would sing that song. One final note about the martyr's song. If you'll notice, when I read through it real quickly, it does not say a single word about the achievements of the martyrs. It is 100% a praise song to the greatness of God's glory only. And what it means, they say, is that in the presence of God, the martyrs forget themselves. In the presence of God, their own accomplishments are insignificant, even to the extent of martyrdom. All right, now.
We could all take a lesson from that.
Yeah, well, we could take a lesson from a whole lot of things here. After this I looked, and in heaven the temple, that is the tabernacle of the testimony, was opened. Out of the temple came the 7 angels with the 7 plagues. They were dressed in clean, shining linen and wore golden sashes around their chests. Then one of the 4 living creatures gave to the 7 angels 7 golden bowls filled with the wrath of God who lives forever and ever. take a minute here to define a couple things. What is the tent of witness? It was also called the tent of testimony. And it was the official title given to the tabernacle in the wilderness before the Jews had come to the promised land. Remember, they had the tent of the tabernacle that they worshipped in. And in the very middle of the tent was the Ark of the Covenant, containing the Ten Commandments. So in this picture of John's vision, he is describing things in terms not of the Jerusalem temple, but of the ancient tabernacle. Second of all, it says, don't let me miss the 7 avenging angels. 7 avenging angels come out of the tent, and the avenging angels are coming from the place where the law of God resides, symbolically, okay? And they have come to show that no man, no nation, no one can defy the law of God with impunity. Okay, what are the shining white robes and golden girdles all about? They symbolize 3 things. The shining white robe and the golden girdle was the official dress of the high priest. Okay? So, the angels are coming out dressed that way. It shows that they are representing God. Second of all, that is also the royal dress, the garments of kings and princes. So they are not only representing God, but they are carrying with them the royalty of the King of Kings. And third, it is also heavenly dress, because if I were to say to any one of you, picture in your mind an angel, what's the first thing you see?
White robe.
Shining white robe. Yeah, okay. So that signifies they were inhabitants of heaven. So that's what that symbolism, little symbolism means right there. Okay, the bowls of wrath are handed to the avenging angels by one of the 4 living creatures. Who are the 4 living creatures again?
Is it the lion and the ox?
And they represent the forces of nature. Okay? That is to say, this is appropriate when you realize that 7 bowls of wrath are going to bring disasters to the nature world, to the world of nature, like earthquake and so on and so forth. It makes sense that the creatures representing nature give the bowls of wrath, because they are now cooperating with God to serve God's purpose. Okay? So, now we have verse 8. We're getting ready to jump in big time here. And I'm hoping we can get as far as Armageddon before we're through today.
Well, Sandy's not here. We can just delay church.
I don't think so.
Right. The temple was filled with smoke from the glory of God and from His power, and no one could enter the temple until the 7 plagues of the 7 angels were completed. The glory of God is symbolized as smoke. That comes right out of the Old Testament. Places like Isaiah chapter 6 talks about smoke as representing the image of God. And furthermore, the idea that no one could approach while the smoke was there is also common Old Testament references, like in Exodus 40 and 1 Kings 8. As long as that representation of God was present, you couldn't approach. Okay? Is it possible for any man to approach until the 7 plagues of the 7 angels have been carried out? No way. No man can halt the coming judgment of God. Chapter 16. Now, it is important to recognize that the long list of horrors that come from the 7 bowls of wrath can be very, very closely compared to 2 other lists. Anybody want to guess what those other lists are? The list of the 10 plagues on Egypt. And the list of terrors following the sounding of the 7 trumpets throughout Revelation chapters 8 through 11. Okay? I'll give you a little bit more of a clear description of that. recall the story back in Exodus of Moses and doing time with Pharaoh. Water turned into blood, frogs, lice, flies, plague on the cattle, boils and sores, thunder and hail, locusts, darkness, and the slaying of the firstborn. Okay, there's the 10 plagues of Egypt. Now you go back to chapters 8 through 11 in Revelation. Hail, fire, and blood. The mountain cast into the sea turns into blood. Waters become bitter and poisonous. The sun, the moon, and the stars are darkened. Smoke comes out of the pit with demonic locusts. The 4 angels bound in the Euphrates dry up the Euphrates, and demonic cavalry comes from the east. All of that sounds familiar. It's roughly compared to the plagues of Egypt. But here in chapter 16, the sea turns to blood, the fountains and rivers turn to blood, the sun becomes scorchingly hot, darkness covers the kingdom, the Euphrates dries up, hordes come from the east, the air is polluted, thunder, earthquake, lightning, and hail. In other words, excuse me, what John has done, he has gathered together all the horrors that he can come up with from every possible source. He puts them all together in one big ball, and he throws that ball at the unbelieving world in one last total, terrible deluge of disaster. There is one difference between chapter 16 and chapter 8 through 11. When they blew the 7 trumpets and all those disasters came, if you will recall, they were limited. Only 1/3 of the earth's population was affected by those. It was supposed to be a warning to the rest, which they ignored. But in this case, in chapter 16, it's not 1/3, it's 100%. This is total. Okay. Verse 1, then I heard a loud voice from the temple saying to the 7 angels, go, pour out the 7 bowls of God's wrath on the earth. The voice from the temple is the voice of God, dispatching his angelic messengers. It's kind of hard to picture angelic messengers with all these horrors in hand, but that's the way John has it envisioned. Verse 2, the first angel went and poured out his bowl on the land, and ugly and painful sores broke out on the people who had the mark of the beast and worshipped his image. So the first terror is malignant, ulcerous sores. And again, this sounds familiar to the boils and sores poured out upon the Egyptians in the plague on Egypt. Verses 3, 4, and 5. The second angel poured out his bowl on the sea, and it turned into blood like that of a dead man, and every living thing in the sea died. The third angel poured out his bowl on the rivers and springs of water, and they became blood. And then I heard the angel in charge of the waters say, you are just in these judgments, you who are and who were the Holy One, because you have so judged. So the second terror that we have here are the waters of the sea and of the rivers and the springs. All the water turns to blood. And this is a horrifying image to Jews. If all the water in the world has turned to blood, there's nothing left to drink but blood. And do you understand the significance of blood to the Jews? It was untouchable. I mean, it was unclean. It was the source of life. It was God's. So you can imagine what a horror this is to the Jewish mind. Then in verse 6, for they have shed the blood of your saints and prophets, and you have given them blood to drink as they deserve. Yuck. And in verse 7, I heard the altar respond, yes, Lord God Almighty, true and just are your judgments. Hear the voice of the altar praises God. What's the voice of the altar? We haven't heard this one before. It is the voice of God's suffering church. it promises the justice of God, which brings wrath down upon the church's enemies. Verses 8 through 9. The fourth angel poured out his bowl on the sun, and the sun was given power to scorch people with fire. They were seared by the intense heat, and they cursed the name of God, who had control over these plagues, but they refused to repent and glorify him. Here you have the voice of the altar praising God's judgments. Then the world is scorched by the sun, but people still don't repent. In other words, people accept the existence of God. They can clearly see God's hand in events taking place, but they still insist on going their own way. And we think to ourselves, well, how stupid can you get? Is that any different than what we do today?
No, I was just thinking that.
You know, is it any different at all than what we do today? We do not doubt the existence of God. We know that God is interested in us and in the world which he has made. We are well aware of God's laws. We know his goodness. And we know that sin has its punishment. And yet, time and time again, we go our own way. Nothing's changed, right? Verse 12. The sixth angel poured out his bowl on the great river Euphrates, and its water was dried up to prepare the way for the kings from the east. Once the great river Euphrates dries up, the way is now open for the hordes of the east to invade, to descend upon the world. And who are these hordes? We talked about this one time earlier, I can't remember exactly where. The greatest enemies of Rome at the time of John were the Parthians, in the area of Persia. The Parthians, who lived beyond the river Euphrates. The Parthian cavalry was the most dreaded force of fighting men in the entire world. And we have the additional dimension added to this picture that we've also talked about before. It was supposedly to Parthia that legend says that Nero went, Nero the Antichrist, and it was there that he was said to have gone, and it was from Parthia that legend said that Nero Redivivus, Nero back to life, was expected to come back. Meaning it was across the river Euphrates that the invasion of the Antichrist was to take place. Then I saw three evil spirits that looked like frogs. They came out of the mouth of the dragon, out of the mouth of the beast, and out of the mouth of the false prophet. They are spirits of demons performing miraculous signs, and they go out to the kings of the whole world to gather them for the battle on the great day of God Almighty. Behold, I come like a thief. Blessed is he who stays awake and keeps his clothes with him, so that he may not go naked and be shamefully exposed. Does that verse sound familiar? It's actually a close quotation from Luke. Then they gathered the kings together to the place that in Hebrew is called Armageddon. You got these four verses, they're crammed completely full of all kinds of interpretive problems. These problems we have to kind of resolve if we're going to get any meaning out of this series of verses at all. These three unclean spirits, like frogs, come out of the mouth of the dragon, the beast, and the false prophet. Now, this is the same as saying in Greek that an evil breath came from the mouth of the three. Because frogs were viewed in the ancient world as very unclean and undesirable critters.
I still view it that way.
Hmm?
I still view them that way.
You still think frogs is that way? Yeah, no. Okay, frogs were always connected with plagues. Okay? When
happened
there was a
with
plague of any
rats?
kind, it was the frogs that brought the plagues. So they were seen as indicative of a plague. Frogs were very unclean. They were seen to stand for unclean influence. Frogs were famous for their empty and continuous croaking, which is to say, the sound of the frog is the symbol for meaningless speech. And, at least in the Persian religion, frogs are the bringer of plagues and to fight against the power of light. So, to say that frogs came out of the mouth of the dragon, the beast, and the false prophet is to say that their words were like plagues, unclean, empty futility, and the power of darkness. All symbolism. But that's what the frogs mean. Okay, don't let that bother you. So, the foul breath is accompanied by words which were like plagues, unclean, empty, and from the powers of darkness. Now we have the false prophet. Where did this guy come from? The false prophet was always a figure that God's people were warned to be on the lookout for. And that's not just New Testament, but that's Old Testament.
Yeah, right.
People were constantly warned. They were warned, do not pay any attention to the false prophet, no matter how impressive the signs he can perform. Pay no attention to the false prophet. It's caused Jesus some problems. Jesus was seen as false Messiah, false prophet, even though he performed miraculous healings and signs. But the Jews would point back to the Old Testament and say, we were warned not to pay any attention to these kind of people. See? They put themselves in a catch-22 catch-22 situation so that they would never recognize the Messiah when he came. As a matter of fact, part of the duty of the Sanhedrin was to identify the false prophet and then condemn him to death. And of course, the Christian church, at the instruction of Jesus himself, was warned of fake Christs, false prophets, fake messiahs, who would try to seduce Christ's people away from the true gospel. So the false prophet in Revelation, in the end, is captured along with the beast. We'll get to this in chapter 19, verse 20. And he is described as the person who worked miracles on behalf of the beast and deceived those who had the mark of the beast and worshipped its image. Okay, that's what that is. The evil spirits go out and stir up all the kings of the world to bring them to war together. This is the idea of the final conflict, right, between God and the forces of evil. And this final battle is to take place at Armageddon. First of all, number one, Armageddon is not an event. It's a place. Today, people say, oh, you know, this is going to happen, the earthquakes and the tsunamis and everything. Armageddon is coming. Armageddon is not an event, it is a place. And the final conflict between good and evil is to take place at that place. So, in the Bible, you will find, depending upon which versions of the Bible you use, Armageddon, dash Mageddon. So even the name is kind of different in different versions.
Hard as a mountain, isn't it? Hard as a mountain.
Yes. Yes, it is. So, Mageddon or Mageddon may well be connected with the name Megiddo. Okay? Megiddo is on the plain of Esdraelon, which was in Israel, which was part of the great highway going from Egypt up to Damascus. So from the most ancient times to the time of Napoleon, really, it was one of the great battlefields in the world. there were more battles and wars fought on the plains of Israelium than any place, anywhere in the world. Is it hard to believe that the final conflict is going to take place on the plains of Israelium? Of course, it makes sense. I mean, this was the place where Barak and Deborah overthrew Sisera. It's the place where Ahaziah died at the hands of Jehu. It's where the good Josiah perished in battle with Pharaoh. All kinds of tragedies and wars and battles took place. And any student of Jewish history would know all those battles because they were all critically important to the history of Israel. So, Armageddon would mean the city of Megiddo, but Harmageddon, as Bruce pointed out, could mean the mountain of Megiddo. It is most likely that the latter form is the correct, and yet the plain seems a much more likely battleground than the mountains. But there's another thing to add to this. When Ezekiel was describing the last struggle between Gog and Magog, remember we talked about that back then, he said the final victory will be won in the mountains of Israel. That's out of Ezekiel 38.
If you stand on the tar, you see the plain where the war.
You been there? Oh, well then this is pretty vivid for
Yeah.
you guys. So it may well be that John spoke of the Mount of Megiddo to bring this story into line with the ancient prophecy. By far the most likely view is that the word is Har-Mageddon, and that it describes the region near Megiddo in the plain of Israelium, which was perhaps the most storied of all battlegrounds in Jewish history.
I thought Megiddo was a father comedian on the left end.
Ay, ay, ay. So, the last of chapter 16 says, then they gathered the kings together in the place that in Hebrew is called Armageddon. The seventh angel poured out the bowl into the air, and out of the temple came a loud voice from the throne saying, it is done. Then there came flashes of lightning, rumblings, peals of thunder, and a severe earthquake. No earthquake like it has ever occurred since man has been on earth, so tremendous was the quake. The great city split into 3 parts, and the cities of the nations collapsed. God remembered Babylon the Great and gave her the cup filled with the wine of the fury of his wrath. Every island fled away, and the mountains could not be found. From the sky, huge hailstones of about 100 pounds each. Big hail. Fell upon men, and they cursed God on account of the plague of hail, because the plague was so terrible. Okay, now remember, we're still pouring out the 7 bowls of God's wrath, and this is the 7th one. It pollutes the very air we breathe. Nature itself now attacks mankind. Earthquakes, the like of which have never been seen, strike with lightning and thunder. Rome, the great Babylon, right, splits into 3 pieces and is destroyed for her sins and imagined impunity. Hi there.
Hi there.
Hi, Joyce.
Islands sink into the sea. Mountains are leveled. 100-weight hailstones bring deadly ruin to everything. The grand finale of the emptied 7 bowls is that man hurls insults at God instead of bowing down and worshiping. Glad you could be here. End of class.
You just missed the end.
timing would be perfect.
Yeah, you just missed the end of the world.
That's probably a good thing.
Next week, we will go into chapter 17, and I'm going to tell you right now, if you think you've had any problems understanding Revelation at this point, prepare yourselves. Chapter 17 is the most difficult chapter in the whole book. And we're going to have to deal with it very carefully to make any sense of it. You might want to read through it a time or two before you come next week. See what you can make out of it. By the way, another thing I've decided to do, we get down to the very last chapter, which is kind of a recap, John's recap of the whole thing. I am not going to describe anything to you. You are going to tell me what all the symbolism in that last chapter means.
I'm gonna sit by Bruce.
Because by the time we get to the chapter 22,
I can't be here next.
I should've been taking.
by the time we get to
That's
chapter
6 weeks
22,
from now.
I'm going to assume that y'all are so well
Oh,
versed
yeah.
in what we've been talking about for weeks and weeks. Now,
Months.
you can interpret chapter 22 all by yourselves.
These are glazed donuts back here.